can you give us a sort of a timeline of how U.S. policy has evolved, devolved over the course of really a little more than a decade now in terms of Syria?
Right. Well, Syria has been, the United States and Syria have been at each other's throats for a long time. Really, it goes back to 1948 and the war, Israel's War of Independence in Palestine, in which Syria joined and supported the Palestinians and joined in opposition to Israel. And this caused relations between Syria and the United States really to go south. And it's been a bumpy ride ever since. In 2011, the major uprising against Assad started, and which turned into a civil war. And Assad hammered the opposition. Very quickly, the United States thought that Assad would fall the way that Gaddafi did and the way the Tunisian president had, and that this would be part of the Arab Spring, that democracy in the Middle East was aborting, and that they could get rid of this thorn in their side. But it didn't turn out so well.
Gaddafi fell as a function of U.S. and European bombing, I think, on some level, right? I mean,
right.
Essentially.
You're right. Yes.
And so when in 2011, I remember there was a very strong sort of like a neocon push to arm the Syrian rebellion, I guess. But what was problematic about that was being able to tell the different factions associated with that rebellion. There were some who were ostensibly pro-democracy forces, and others who were more, I guess, militant Islamist groups. And so when did we start actually like physically engaging in that conflict?
Right. President Obama was very reluctant to get America involved in the fighting. And he said in 2011, September, he said Assad should step aside. But the next sentence, which nobody remembers, was that, but America's not going to make him do it. So this was sort of a contradictory message. And it was emblematic of Obama's administration's policy towards Syria. They wanted Assad to fall. They hoped he would fall on his own as a product of this uprising, but they didn't want to get deeply involved. And that led America into many problems in the future, because already in 2012, you see Secretary of Defense saying, we don't want the Syrian army to collapse because the chemical weapons might get into the hands of Hezbollah. And then by 2013, Mike Morrell, the deputy director of the CIA, went on 60 Minutes and gave a long interview in which he said, we don't want the Syrian army to collapse or to be destroyed, because Syria might break apart, or even worse, that Islamist factions, the jihadists like Al-Qaeda, would take Damascus. And that became the major fear, that the radicals were much stronger than the liberal Syrians. They had militias on the ground. They knew how to fight. They'd had experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that they were going to win. So America turned really around and didn't want the army to fall. They wanted Assad to leave, but they thought the army might come to America for a deal if they weakened it enough, but they didn't want it to collapse. And Mike Morrell, the deputy director of CIA, said at the end of this interview, he said, we don't want the army to collapse, because that would be we're going to need the army to destroy Al-Qaeda when this is done. And that's the assessment of America. So America gave money to the opposition, gave arms to the opposition, wanted to weaken the Syrian army, but thought the Syrian army would come to America for a deal. And it didn't. Ultimately, the Russians stepped in 2015, and the Syrians went to the Russians. They didn't go to the Americans, which was logical because Russia was their major. And I think America actually sighed a sigh of relief when the Russians entered in. They didn't say that, of course. They clucked at their tongue at the Russians, but I think they were worried because ISIS by that time had become the dominant Islamist faction, and it was at the doors of Damascus. And had ISIS taken Damascus, it would have been devastating for America. So I think Russia then and America had a division of labor. America decided we're not going to worry about Assad anymore. We're just going to uniquely go after ISIS. And we dumped the Syrian Sunni opposition that we had been supporting, and we armed the Kurds. And we became partners with the Kurds, who are our proxy military and still are today. We still own 30% of Syrian territory. And we left the Russians and Assad to go after al-Qaeda and the rest of the Syrian opposition, including those militias that we had armed and trained. And so that led to Assad winning, and it's where he is today.
And just to and to clarify too, when that shift happened, and I imagine these were, some of these were lessons from the Iraq and
Yes,
how we had disbanded the Ba'athist army, and that created, in some respects, it created a new enemy for both the United States within the context of Iraq and for the rest of Iraq. So when we decided to stop arming the Sunni uprising in Syria, when did we insert troops? I mean, the troop numbers, if I'm not mistaken, are somewhere a little bit below 1,000 troops.
Right. That's what we're told. And there's a lot of contractors and others. We just had the Iranian supported militia in Syria sent we don't know if it was in Iraq, actually sent a drone and killed one American soldier, or wounded an American soldier, killed 5 contractors. So a lot of the people working there are contractors, and I assume military people as well.
And do we know the numbers of contractors that we have deployed?
We don't really. People have guessing that there's around 2,000 possibly, but there's about 1,000 American soldiers. That's usually the number that's given. And then, so it's not a lot. And we have this big Kurdish-led military, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They were named by America, needless to say, and they are staffed. The upper echelons are staffed largely by Kurds who look to America, who hope to gain, if not a great deal of autonomy, perhaps Kurdish independence. They call the region Rojava, which means Western Kurdistan, and they're America's their protector. And the moment America leaves, they will have to make a deal with Assad, who will eliminate their independent militia and bring them back under state control, and that's what they're worried about.
Okay, and so that's about 30% of the territory up in the Northeast that
yes.
We are helping the Kurds essentially maintain there. So
yes, and it's got most of the oil. It's got most of Syria's oil, which we raised the Syrian army, and with these Russian soldiers as well. They were militiamen. They weren't part of the Russian army, and we killed about 200 Russians in a race for these oil wells. And America got them as ISIS, which owned them at the time, was collapsing. Everybody was trying to get the oil because they knew that was going to be key to sustaining the future of Syria. America got it, and that's what largely funds the Kurdish military in the Northeast. So it's not that much money for America to remain there.